There are 8 million stories in the naked city of Toronto. Last night, driving back from London, Ontario, where I addressed a meeting, as Ron correctly told you, last night driving back, I stopped my car at an intersection in Yonge Street and Bloor Street and found to my horror that the man sitting in the next car, his features distorted with hatred, was Simon Wiesenthal. Yeah! These ugly, cruel features were leering at me over the steering wheel, and for a moment I had a nightmare. I realized, in fact, it wasn't, of course, it was a Halloween mask. I understand there's a story, and I may be completely untrue, that, in fact, at Halloween, on the day after Halloween, Mrs. Wiesenthal says, "Simon, please put the mask back on." We shouldn't be too unkind on Mr. Wiesenthal, of course. He has done a certain amount of in-depth, detailed research into history, and we mustn't forget that Simon Wiesenthal, despite many weeks and months of patient research on the case of Kurt Waldheim, was unable to turn up anything at all in the archives, except rumors that Waldheim had once applied for membership of the Bund Deutscher Mädchen. I mention these facts because, of course, Wiesenthal is a plague upon us all, and he must be deeply upset that that great prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, has been awarded to another man and not to himself, a man who is a professional survivor, a messenger of the survival of the Holocaust. Personally, I don't begrudge him the prize. If my name was Weasel for the rest of my life, I think I too. Although, what we do know is that none of these historians, the Weasels, the Wiesenthals, none of the great academic historians, indeed, of the world, have told us the whole truth. And if I'm known for something as a historian, it's because I don't shun talking about any aspect of the truth. I regret deeply when the results of my publication cause myself, my agents, my publishers, my family, of course, also distress and terror. I've had my front door in England sledgehammered. I know that your writers in Canada also come up against these increasing problems. I've had printing works burned down that publish my works in England. I've had my own home raided by people purporting to be members of the General Post Office in Britain. They came equipped with all the identity cards and so on. They claimed to be from the Post Office. I caught the lot of them. We all found out who was really behind it. The police came and told me later on which organization was behind it. They went to prison, of course. And I'm not going to reveal details of these gentlemen concerned who are still residing in prison, because if I revealed details about the organization behind them, I would be accused of anti-Semitism. I think it's necessary to say these things because, of course, the writing of history has become an increasingly dangerous occupation for us here in the West. And this is because there is the old truth, the old witticism, the old wisdom, in fact, that if you are not prepared to learn from history, then you're condemned to repeat it. And we're not wanting to repeat history. We have seen in the last 50 years how an evil force, an evil power has encroached upon more and more of the surface of this globe, and the number of people still living in freedom, the number of people still living in the West is now reduced to about 1/3 or 1/4 of the total population of the world. And it's our duty really to stand up, to recognize ourselves, to identify the friends of freedom, and to perceive who are in fact the enemies of that cause. It's our duty to do that, whatever the risks and the dangers that we expose ourselves to. And since I set out on my one-man crusade, circling the globe 2 times already since I came here in Toronto, going around the world, not because anybody is paying me to do it. I'm not paid by the CIA or by the British government or the South African government or by Martin Bormann's secret checks or by anything like that. I just finance myself by going around the world carrying heavy suitcases full of books. And I speak and I sell my books. Regrettably, I've got no books to offer you today because I think you probably know what's happened here in Canada. My famous book on the Hungarian uprising of 1956, published in England by one of our oldest and most respectable publishing houses, the Hodder and Stoughton Company. We imported 2,000 copies of that into Vancouver, where my tour started, and they have been impounded by the Canadian customs, as though there was some kind of shoddy work of pornography. And I suppose copies have been sent along to Ottawa to be investigated by the customs officials there, along with copies of Girl Scout Gangbang and all the other works upon which they should really be dedicating their attention. My book will not be available probably for several days, probably just after I've left Canada. Will they release it and they will realize their mistake? And of course the people behind this particular little episode are the people who are forced to identify themselves with the villains of the Hungarian uprising of 1956. When they read my history of the Hungarian uprising, they see that I quite clearly identify the people's uprising of 1956 in Hungary as having all the traces, all the characteristics of a pogrom. It started as a pogrom and eventually it evened out, but the initial phases, it was quite clearly a pogrom. And if you read the interrogations that were carried out by the CIA of the thousands of survivors who came out, as I have done, I've read all those interrogations, you see that the CIA, the British, the Americans, the Germans, who questioned all these people, identified the pogrom quality in the initial phases of the uprising. The regime in Hungary was identified quite clearly as having a certain character. It had been imposed on Hungary by the Soviet Union. The people concerned, Revai, Farkas, Gerő, Rákosi, all these cruel, murderous Hungarian leaders who were imposed on Budapest in 1945, 1946, rode into power not on a democratic wave of popular support. They were brought back into power by the Soviet tanks. They were all members of a certain faith. The people they employed were also members of a certain faith, which is understandable because they were the ones, of course, the Jews and the communists picked to run their terror system, the Államvédelmi Hatóság, the secret state police authority in Hungary. And this is a very ugly truth. It was a truth that was once spoken, in fact, by Winston Churchill back in 1920. An article by Churchill on the Zionists and the Zionist origins of the Bolshevik Revolution, an article which he wrote and was published in the London Illustrated Weekly. And it was so vicious, this writing by Winston Churchill back in 1920, that at first I thought that it was a fake. And I'm something of a specialist in fake documents. As you know, I'm the one who exposed the Hitler diaries as being fake right in the middle of the press conference of Der Stern magazine back in April 1983. I exposed them as fake, and I explained why I thought those documents were fake. And I thought that this Winston Churchill article on the Zionists was a fake. But no. It was completely genuine. I contacted, in fact, in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, the University of Portland, where they have a specialist department specializing in Churchill's bibliography. A list is kept, an index, a computer index of all Winston Churchill's works, and they wrote to me saying regretfully, yes, Winston Churchill had written that appalling article back in 1920. This is the kind of thing I shall be telling you in a minute or two, because later on we find that Winston Churchill, for some mysterious reason, switched his aim. In the middle of the 1930s, he suddenly became, from being a dedicated anti-Zionist, he became what he described in a private letter to Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, one of the world's foremost secret Zionists, a closet Zionist. I'm quoting his actual letter because the Israeli government were good enough to give me complete and unrestricted access to the private papers of Chaim Weizmann in the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel for my Winston Churchill biography. You can understand that as I've been able to use papers like that, I'm running up into problems with the Churchill biography now. We're going to find that it's going to be very difficult for me to publish my Churchill biography anywhere in the world. My Hitler biography, on which I dedicated 10 years of my life from 1964 to 1974, was published initially without problems all the way around the world, and I'm glad to say that that biography is gradually becoming the standard work because it is based entirely on original documents. And yet, the Churchill biography, one publisher after another, is tearing up the contract now that they've read the manuscript. Doubleday in the United States has torn up the contract and demanded that I repay $100,000 because, quote unquote, Mr. Irving, you have found out things in your book about Winston Churchill that the American public would prefer not to be told. And the same in Britain, and the same in France, and the same in Germany. They've torn up the contracts. In Germany, fortunately, one of the biggest, boldest, bravest publishing houses, a left-wing liberal publishing house, has come forward and has offered now to take over that manuscript and to publish it. In the English-speaking world, we're going to publish it ourselves, you and me. I have found capital in Australia and the United States, people who are raising £150,000 to capitalize the publication of my book in the original unexpurgated form, because as I say in German, I say it in English, es gibt nur die eine Wahrheit, die totale Wahrheit, that's my slogan in German. There's only one truth, and that is total truth. You've got to publish the truth, whether you like it or not. Let me give you an example of that. I'll give you an example of that. Winston Churchill writing his famous 6-volume history of the war. A magnificent literary work, if I may say so. I hope that when I'm as old as Churchill, I'm still able to pour out volumes of that complexity and that magisterial quality. Winston Churchill, he wanted to publish a certain piece of evidence that he had about where the Germans got their money, where Adolf Hitler got his money in the rise to power. In that final desperate, headlong rush to the Nazi revolution in 1933, when the Germans, the Nazi party, were almost on the point of bankruptcy, somebody put up the money for Adolf Hitler in order to ensure that he came into power. Winston Churchill knew the answer, because Winston Churchill was privately told this in a letter dated August 28, 1937, by Dr. Heinrich Brüning. Dr. Heinrich Brüning, I should tell you, those who don't know, was Adolf Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor in Germany. With a short interim government, Brüning had been the long-term German Chancellor. Hitler had overthrown him. The Nazi revolution had swept Brüning aside. Brüning, being the Prime Minister of Germany, the Chancellor, of course, knew who had financed Hitler because his secret service, his wiretapping agencies had been listening to Hitler's telephone conversations and opening his mail. They knew where the money came from. And Brüning, when he fled to England after Hitler came to power, told Winston Churchill privately in a letter, August the 28th, 1937. And Churchill wanted to quote that letter in his post-war memoirs, the big 6-volume book. And Churchill's memoirs, as you know, were published by the Life magazine, serialized by Life in 1948, 49, 50. And that is why among the private papers of Life magazine's chief editor, I found the letters, the ones that I'm going to quote to you now, because you won't find them in the Churchill archives for the simple reason that if you are writing about Churchill, even if your name is William Manchester, which it isn't, thank God, you will not be given access to the private papers of Churchill. The Churchill family has put their hand on those papers and will not allow them to be seen by anybody, except for one authorized biographer, Martin Gilbert, a dedicated Zionist who is partly financed by the Jaffa Foundation, as he writes in the introduction to his Churchill biographies. So we can't get access to the Churchill papers. We've got to go everywhere else, which is what I do. I go all the way around the world working in these archives, like, as I mentioned, the archives of Life magazine in the United States. And there I found this letter, Churchill writing to Brüning saying, in August 1937, you wrote me a letter, which I want to quote in my memoirs, about who paid Hitler in 1933 and the years up to the Nazi Revolution. And Brüning wrote back to him. Here's the letter dated February the 7th, 1948, from the private files of the chief editor of Life magazine. Never published, and you're hearing it for the first time now. Brüning said he couldn't give Churchill permission to quote that letter because it was too painful, in view of everything that happened in Germany during the Third Reich, in view, of course, of the Holocaust, to have to admit this. He says, I didn't then, and do not even today, for understandable reasons, wish to reveal that from October 1928, the two largest regular contributors to the Nazi Party were the general managers of two of the largest Berlin banks, both of the Jewish faith, and one of them the leader of Zionism in Germany. Now, I don't know whether Brüning is a reliable source, and let me make that quite plain. Brüning was admittedly the Chancellor of Germany before Hitler. He had all the Secret Service methods of surveillance at his fingertips. He could find out things like this. So he was in a position to know what he's writing about, which is an important criterion on documents. As a historian, and I was taught this by Trevor Roper himself in England, as a historian, when you're looking at a document, you've got to ask yourself 3 important questions. Why has that document been written? What purpose? Because it may be a document written for spurious purposes, like, for example, a document being written in order to cover up a certain truth. Is the document genuine? Also an important question, because there are a lot of fake documents floating around, but I know how to detect them. I've got a lot of comparisons, I've got a lot of expertise in detecting fakes. I've been flooded with fakes over the last 20 years, and I don't think I've fallen victim of a single one, because you can always, if the worst comes to the worst, I've got a very good laboratory which I rely on in the City of London, who work for the insurance industry, Hayner and Cox Limited, and they carry out the forensic tests on the paper, the black light tests, the ink, the type of typewriter used, and so on, and they can tell me if a document has been faked or not. That's the second question, is the document fake? And the third important question is the man who wrote the document in a position to know what he's purporting to write about? A very important criterion. It's no use having the private diary of a street sweeper in Berlin if you want to find out what's going on in the Chancellor in the Wilhelmstrasse. You need to have a document written by somebody in a position to know. And this document, of course, by Brüning, the letter by Brüning to Churchill, is by a man technically in a position to know. He wrote that, and he said he didn't want to reveal in 1947 that, unfortunately, the money which had brought Hitler into power was paid by these two Berlin banks and their general managers, about which he made that remark, which, if I was to make it, of course, would be considered deeply objectionable. I'm not making it. Let me emphasize that. It's being made by Dr. Heinrich Brüning himself, who died only a few years ago. You see the problems we're up against when we look at the history of the Second World War. And it's a problem which we can learn from now, because if we were being duped at the time about the leaders in the Second World War, about your own Prime Minister Mackenzie King, about the Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies, about Roosevelt, about Churchill, about Hitler and Stalin, if we were being duped at the time, and if we were being successfully lied to, and if these lies have been told to us so well that they are still now believed, even today, 50 years later, aren't we required to ask ourselves certain questions about major issues of political importance which are being turned out to us now by those modern historians, the journalists, the newspaper trade, the media men, and ask ourselves, isn't this a new embryo lie in the creation? And of course it is, and I'm going to tell you at the end of this talk certain episodes which make me convinced that we are being lied to. We're being lied to about Libya, we're being lied to about South Africa. But first of all, let me, so to speak, establish my credentials as somebody capable of detecting long-term lies. How do these lies come into existence? Well, the answer is lies are particularly generated in wartime because you can only persuade the soldiers to fight in wartime by telling them lies, because man's natural instinct isn't to go around hunting and killing. Man's natural instinct nowadays is to sit in front of the telly at home or whatever the 1940s equivalent of that was. So to get him to go out and fight, as Mrs. Thatcher did at the time of the Falklands crisis, you've got to start the propaganda machinery rolling, and the propaganda flywheel begins to spin. And this propaganda flywheel is given more and more impetus as the war gets bigger and the cost gets larger, and you have to justify what you're doing. And the propaganda flywheel in World War II was set in motion by Winston Churchill, who was the world's greatest liar, and I use that in the sense of the utmost admiration. He was the world's, in fact, he himself said, the truth is so precious, it has to be protected in a bodyguard of lies. He said that to Mackenzie King on September the 17th, 1944. If you go to your archives here in Ottawa, you'll find it in the Mackenzie King original diary. The truth is so precious. And so the lies are churned out. And the trouble is that when the war ends, nobody has an interest in putting his hand on that flywheel and stopping it. So the wheel continues to spin and is still spinning now of its own momentum 40 or 50 years later. And the same old lies are being turned out, because who can profit from putting his hand on that flywheel and stopping it? One thing is quite certain: you'll get burnt if you do, and so on balance you don't. Certainly the politicians don't. Certainly the people who fought the war don't. The only people who should do it is the historian, because as Winston Churchill himself rightly said, the historian's job is to find out what happened and why. What happened and why. And there's no reason why you shouldn't find it out, because when you've won a war, you get access to all the enemy's records, all the people are available, and you can genuinely find out what happened and why. But you're wasting your time if you look in the official records, the official histories. I can give you 2 or 3 examples of why you shouldn't look in the British official histories of what happened and why. You won't find it. If you look in the entire British histories of the Second World War, for example, you won't find a single reference to Ultra, to the code-breaking secret, the fact that we were winning the war because we were reading almost all the German military and diplomatic messages throughout the war. And the reason why is because after the war, the chiefs of staff and the cabinet in Britain united with the cabinets of the governments all the way around the world and agreed that no official historians would even be told about Ultra. And so those official historians are virtually useless. You can't rely on their works. That's just one little example of why we can't rely on the official historians. I'll give you another example. Captain Stephen Roskill, our naval historian in Britain, he quotes a particular diary entry on April 11th, 1940, of Captain Ralph Edwards, director of the Operations Division in the Admiralty in Britain, referring to the fact that his First Lord, which is Winston Churchill at that time, the First Lord of the Admiralty, has come to that evening's board meeting at the Admiralty very tired. Now that's the actual quotation which the Captain Stephen Roskill puts in the official naval history. I've seen the original diary, ladies and gentlemen, and in handwritten, in ink, Captain Edwards has written, "Winston arrived at this evening's board meeting half tight." So that is completely different, and I'm not just quoting that to you because it's a humorous example. A humorous example, it would be humorous if he was just drunk. People who are drunk are sometimes jolly to look at. They're rather droll to behold. Winston Churchill was droll, but it was not humorous for the British or the British Empire, because he attended Admiralty meetings, he attended cabinet meetings and defence meetings right through the Second World War in a state of intoxication. And this has been concealed and covered up. It has not been written about. It has been deliberately camouflaged by the official historians because it is such a shameful fact that they daren't admit it. And I was speaking in South Africa only last month in September. In Pretoria, I think it was, and one of the radio journalists there sneered at me and said, "How can David Irving say, as he said in a speech yesterday in Durban, I understand, that Winston Churchill attended his cabinet meetings in a state of drunkenness? If this was true, why don't we find it in the diaries of people like General Allenbook, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, which have been published and are long available to the historians?" And the answer is because General Allenbook didn't dare to quote from his diaries, which I have. Allenbook's original handwritten diaries, little leather-bound volumes, locked with a lock and key like a Victorian lady's diaries, you remember, locked by a little metal strap and key so you can't open them. Allenbook's original diaries are in the University of London, in the Strand, in the King's College. You can read them there if you've got the energy. Nobody does because they prefer the printed volumes. If you look in the original handwritten volumes, you see that Allenbook has referred to Churchill's drunkenness in cabinet meetings again and again and again until he no longer bothers to say it. Rather like the famous episode, you remember, the ship's captain who says to his mate, "If you write down in the ship's log one more time that I was drunk on duty this evening, I'll have you keel-hauled." And the ship's mate the next day writes in his ship's log, "Today the captain was sober," which has precisely the same effect. And Alan Brooke, of course, no longer bothers to write it in his diary after a time. He occasionally refers to it when it is a matter of supreme moment. I'll give you another example. Admiral Cunningham, the first Sea Lord in Britain, Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham, a fine old red-eyed English sea dog, an extraordinary man. He kept a handwritten diary which is in the British Museum at this moment. You can go and read it if you've got the energy. There's no restrictions, but people don't go to read it. Now, I'll explain why in a minute. He writes repeatedly in his diary about Churchill attending cabinet meetings in a state of tired emotionability, as I suppose Private Eye would say, completely drunk, in other words, intoxicated. And I'll only mention one example, and that's on July the 6th, 1944. July the 6th, 1944, he says Churchill attended the cabinet meeting in a state of intoxication. He talked and talked from 10 p.m. until 2 in the morning, 4 hours, and he hardly let anybody get a word in edgeways. And it's only of interest because it shows that it was by no means humorous or funny or ridiculous or droll when Churchill was drunk, because on that day he took this decision, which I have here, signed by Churchill, July the 6th, 1944. You can see his initials and date on the end. This is the day that Churchill took this decision to start poison gas warfare. Although we had signed the protocols at Geneva, the Geneva Gas Convention, we would never ever use poison gas, Churchill decided to commit a war crime. He was going to have poison gas bombs dropped on all the biggest German cities immediately, and he ordered the General Staff, the Air Staff, to prepare it forthwith. To commit a war crime. We had the bombs ready, the mustard gas and all the other poison gases. We had tens of thousands of bombs filled, and we had 2 million bombs filled with anthrax germs. Also, a little-known fact, a friend of mine in the BBC found this out, Robert Harris. He wrote an article about it, and of course you can imagine the vitriol which was poured on him for having revealed this little fact, that Churchill was wanting to drop 2 million anthrax bombs on Germany. Although anthrax, as you know from a farming community, any of you, is a deadly killer. A deadly killer of livestock, of human beings. We tried one anthrax bomb on one island off the Scottish coast during the war just to see if it worked. And that island is still uninhabitable today, ladies and gentlemen. It is a criminal offence to go anywhere near that island. It is a lethal offence, of course, to put your foot on that island because you are dead within a short space of time. That's the effect of anthrax. Churchill had 2 million filled. He wanted to drop them beginning with July 1944 because 2 reasons. He couldn't break out of the bridgehead in Normandy. The Normandy bridgehead was becoming a millstone round the British neck. Rommel was putting up a colossal fight there, and we couldn't break out, so he wanted to use it to destroy the German morale. And also because the German flying bomb bombardment had begun against England, the V-1s, the Doodlebugs, these dreadful pilotless bombs were being fired at London. I know they were very unpleasant. They went right overhead every night, every half hour. You couldn't sleep. They made the most awful noise, psychologically speaking, a weapon of the most infamous terror. And Churchill wanted to hit back against this revenge weapon of the Germans, poison gas. I want you to think very seriously, he wrote on this drunken evening, I want you to think very seriously over this question of poison gas. It's absurd to consider morality because, of course, the whole argument had been about whether we're going to allow ourselves to commit a war crime or not. It's absurd to consider morality on this topic when everybody used it in the last war without a word of complaint from the moralists or the church. On the other hand, in the last war, the bombing of open cities was regarded as forbidden. Now everybody does it as a matter of course. It's simply a question of fashion changing as she does between long and short skirts for women. I don't think you often hear that quoted in your newspapers over here when we always regard with fond admiration and nostalgia the record of Winston Churchill. I want a cold-blooded calculation made as to how it would pay us to use poison gas. I only mention this example because it gives us a direct yardstick with which to compare Hitler and Churchill. On other matters, of course, you have no yardstick because they're 2 completely different worlds and mentalities. But on this particular one, poison gas, you've got 1 yardstick. And I can tell you, you can take it from me, I've read the entire German documentation for 10 years. All the way through the German files, Adolf Hitler has flatly and emphatically forbidden and embargoed anywhere the use of poison gas. It's there, the actual document signed by Hitler, the references in the files of the German High Command, the verbatim references by him in the shorthand records of his meetings, the shorthand records of meetings in the German Air Ministry. The Führer has absolutely forbidden the use of poison gas. The enemy is to use it first, and then we will retaliate with ours. The reason being, the reason that makes this yardstick so extraordinary is that if Churchill had done what he was threatening and dropped the poison gas on German cities, the Germans would have won the war, because the Germans had not just poison gases like mustard, the Germans had nerve gases. At this time, in 1944, they already had stockpiles of 30,000 tons of nerve gases. Sarin and taboon, the famous nerve gases being used even now by the Russians in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Angola and elsewhere where the Russian troops are fighting. The nerve gases sarin and taboon, Hitler already had stockpiles of 30,000 tons, and nobody found out till the war was over. Which is just as well, because if Hitler had ever used it in Normandy, fighting the Allied, the American, the French, the British troops in Normandy, the Canadians as well, It would have been the end of the bridgehead, because we didn't have a gas mask. We had no gas mask which would have stopped the German nerve gases. It would have been the end of the bridgehead. And isn't it strange that Adolf Hitler, the devil incarnate, had the means whereby he could have secured an immediate strategic advantage which would have turned the war, because he would have pulled the 9 or 10 panzer divisions out of Normandy and sent them to the Russian front, and with those high-grade divisions he would have wiped the floor with the Russians and ended the war by Christmas 1944. But he had put his name on a piece of paper, the Geneva Gas Protocol, saying that he would never use gas first because it would be a war crime.